Hello, and welcome back to another episode of You Are Not Your Diagnosis. Today's episode, we're going to talk about the gut microbiome. And if you don't know what that is, don't worry, I'm going to explain what it is and the connection between the health of that microbiome and autoimmune disease. So autoimmune disease is one of the main issues that I work with many clients on. I've worked with many women who are currently living with autoimmune disease, and this is a very, very important topic. It's a very important topic for all of us because the health of our gut microbiome is very important for our health in general. But I want to also point out a connection that is starting to be made by science and research between imbalances in this microbiome and autoimmune disease. So that's what we'll be up to today in our episode. So let's start out by talking about what is the microbiome to begin with. You may have heard of it, you may not, so I want to make sure that we're all on the same page and you know what it is. So the microbiome is a community of good bacteria in our body, and we all have this. There are many, many strains of bacteria housed throughout our body, and it's not just in our gut microbiome, but for today we're going to be talking a lot about the gut microbiome in particular. And all of these microbes are actually incredibly important. They do a lot of different functions. They actually make some hormones and neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine. A lot of that gets made in our gut by these good bacteria. They help us produce and break down vitamins and nutrients. So we all have thousands, well, not thousands, but millions and millions of these good bacteria living in our bodies. And they live, again, in our gut, in our digestive system. They live on our skin. They live in our mouths. They live in a variety of areas, in the eyes. So a lot of places where our bodies meet the outside world. They live inside the lungs as well. So if you think of places that are kind of barriers to the world, but yet they're still inside of our body, our lungs and our digestive system, those are areas where we have these communities of good bacteria. And we actually are more bug than we are human. So there's about a 10-to-1 ratio of bacteria, good bacteria in our body to actual human cells. Some people, that freaks them out. I have a friend who doesn't want to believe that. It kind of grosses her out. But we all are made up of all these microbes. And yes, we often hear about bacteria being bad things, and there are pathogens, bad bacteria out there that can cause disease, illness, viruses, all those things. But most of these bacteria that are in our bodies are actually good things. They're what we call commensals, or mutualists, and that means they do valuable tasks for our human body and our cells and things that we can't do on our own, and we rely on them to break down our food in ways that our bodies can't. They're part of our immune system as well, and so they're very, very important. And in particular, thinking about the digestive system and the gut is actually part of your immune system. So if you think of what we do on a daily basis when we intake food and drink and things like that, we're taking things in, and the body actually has to determine regularly, is this dangerous or is it safe? Is this good for me or is it bad? Is this an enemy or is it a friend? And so part of what your gut does, your whole gut, but your gut microbiome plays a role in this as well, is to determine what is good and what's bad. So now that we've kind of talked about what is the microbiome, what is starting to be shown in terms of imbalances in this microbiome and the connection between things like autoimmune disease. So a lot of the studies I was able to find really were focused a lot on rheumatoid arthritis in particular as a type of autoimmune disease, and trying to understand if there's a connection between a change in these communities of good bacteria and developing rheumatoid arthritis. So I'm going to share a couple studies, what I was able to find in a short look today. And there's so much research out there that's been done in about the past 30 years on the microbiome and really understanding these bacteria. Because we're coming out of really a model where, again, we used to just see like germ theory of disease, like all bacteria bad, all bacteria causes illness, and that's really not the case. So now we're really trying to understand through science and research the connection and what do all of these different bacteria that are good and that live in our bodies do. But for the purpose of this, I want to just talk about a couple studies that link kind of changes in the microbiome to developing autoimmune disease, especially in the case of these studies I was able to find rheumatoid arthritis. But there are a couple about inflammatory bowel disease. There was actually one about MS as well. So there's a lot of interesting research out there. And if it intrigues you, you can do a Google search, and a lot of it is pretty readable, not super duper scientific, need a medical degree to understand it or a science degree. So the first study that was really interesting was one that was done in 2012 by the Mayo Clinic. And they were talking about how people with rheumatoid arthritis often have a larger population than normal of one specific strain of gut bacteria. And that could trigger the activation of rheumatoid arthritis and the creation of that, and also fuel the prevention of the disease. So they were finding one particular strain of bacteria. The study also was interesting because it talks about kind of leaky gut, and that may be a phrase you've heard because it's one that's kind of used a fair amount in terms of alternative health. Even Western medicine talks about kind of what is leaky gut, and that's basically kind of the wall of the gut lining becomes permeable, which it really shouldn't. It should be able to maintain a good tight seal and a tight barrier so that your food doesn't leak out of your digestive system into your body. Other things that don't belong there, like some of the good bacteria, they belong in the digestive system. They don't belong elsewhere, and they can create problems there. So this particular article was talking about that leaky gut and where the good bacteria actually breaches into the body because of this permeability. Then we get the autoimmune response because the immune system is saying, hey, these good bacteria don't belong here, and they start attacking things. And then that creates the cascade of overreactivity, inflammation, and all sorts of things that we don't really want to have happen in our bodies. So another study that I found talked about how rheumatoid arthritis was linked in newly diagnosed people. 75% of newly diagnosed patients had an expansion of a pro-inflammatory strain of bacteria. So again, one single strain making a huge difference in developing this particular condition from what they can tell so far with research. And then another study that was published in the journal Autoimmunity talked about introducing one single type of bacteria, and this was a study done on mice, into a sterile gut of the mice was enough to create an immune-mediated arthritis. So very interesting that these three studies just talk about one particular strain. I've read other things out there, not specific studies, that talk about just a general shift in the nature and the dynamic of the microbiome in general in people with autoimmune. So an overpopulation of certain types of bacteria that maybe should be there, but not in huge numbers, a dying off of other bacteria that are really needed. So they're not there, or they're very lacking in numbers. And one thing too that was really interesting in the studies I was looking at, because it's very interesting and there's been a lot of kind of curiosity about why do more women have autoimmune disease than men. And so one of the studies was correlating the impact of the gut bacteria on sex hormones and saying that the link between that has something to do with why women develop autoimmune much more commonly than men do. So these are very interesting, and there was another study that I didn't kind of write the details down, but talking about changes even in the oral microbiome. So introducing a particular strain of kind of bad bacteria or one that there shouldn't be in that area, creating problems and leading to developing rheumatoid arthritis as well. So overall, we're creating disruptions in our microbiome a lot in modern society. And I want to talk about that because I think it's important to understand how do we start getting these imbalances in our microbiome from what is optimal and how they're meant to be, And then we'll talk a little bit more about what can you do to try and support rebalancing your microbiome, because that is a huge thing that really can benefit your health and your healing. And I've seen that for many of my clients, that working with this particular area and creating more balance and optimization in the microbiome tremendously supports health and healing. So first of all, what causes these imbalances in our microbiome? So number one is diet. So all of these good bacteria that live in our gut and probably throughout the rest of the body, but we're focused again on the gut microbiome, they need a diet of a lot of plant fiber. So a lot of leafy green vegetables, basically. And we should eat, I can't remember the number that I heard. I think it's at least like 7 or 8 times what we're told the daily amount of recommended fiber is. Ideally for our microbiome, we need that much more for those good bacteria that need to be there, for them to have enough food, for them to be happy and healthy and thriving. But most of us don't eat a lot of leafy green vegetables. We don't eat a lot of plant fiber. What do we eat? We eat processed foods, perhaps, sugar, we drink alcohol. We also have a lot of different chemically based things that we put into our food. So artificial sweeteners, preservatives, all of those things really create a disruption in the microbiome. And certain types of microbes that might be there and should be there, but only in small numbers, they start to take over when we eat things like a lot of sugar. So we get an overabundance of certain strains of bacteria, and the ones that we really, really want that would benefit our health the most start to die off because they're not getting the food that they need in terms of the plant fiber material. So then that'll be one of the points we come back to about what you can do, is start to think about changing your diet and really supporting your microbiome. Another reason that our microbiome gets severely imbalanced in modern society is rampant use of antibiotics. So with the development of antibiotics, they certainly have been life-saving in many cases, can save people from dying of infections and things like that. But at the same time, we've come to use them so much, and most antibiotics don't really discriminate against the good bacteria versus the bad. So when we take them, they're kind of just like a big bomb that goes off and kills everything, good bacteria included. So that's not to say never take antibiotics, but the widespread use of them is certainly one of the things that tips our microbiome into an imbalanced state, because we're killing off all the good bacteria as well as the bad. So being really mindful of if it's really necessary, because sometimes nowadays it can be common to prescribe an antibiotic. Someone has something that looks like a cold, so a virus, which is not something that responds to an antibiotic, but there's kind of a question, could it be developing into an infection? Could it be bacterial? So here's some antibiotics in case. That really doesn't benefit your microbiome. So being just much more mindful about that. The use of antibacterial products is also another huge factor in what disrupts our microbiome. So luckily, I think we're shifting a bit away from this in society now, but there has been a widespread use of hand sanitizers, antibacterial products, things to wipe down your counter that kill everything and anything, and that's also killing off all the good bacteria and creating what are those superbugs, which is not really the topic here, but it's definitely relevant, because by killing everything off except the things that become really resistant, that develop a strong resistance, then we're actually creating more problems. And so there are things that are developed, bugs that are resistant to that we don't want around. So being careful of those particular types of products. And then stress. Stress is very hard on the microbiome. A lot of the good bacteria don't do very well with stress. They can die off. Some of them can get triggered into what in my work, we call a frenemy state. So they start acting like they're pathogens, even though they're good bacteria. And that's all due to stress. So stress has a powerful impact on our microbiome and can kill off good bacteria or make them start misbehaving. So being very mindful of that particular factor as well. So how can you help your microbiome? I've given you a lot of information about the microbiome and how important it is and how it can be linked through these new studies to autoimmune disease and other issues. But how can you help? What can you do about your microbiome to support it better? So again, coming back to one of the things that disrupts it, we need to change our diet. Lots of plant fiber, cutting out sugar, things that are processed, things that have toxins in them, basically, which are preservatives and chemicals, alcohol, trying to reduce that, all of those things. So make it as nice and hospitable for all of those good bacteria in your gut so that they can have a happy, healthy place to live. Avoiding antibiotics, as I mentioned, unless they're absolutely necessary, not just taking them as kind of a light precaution. And then avoiding those antibacterial products, soaps, cleansers, hand sanitizers. I certainly, if I need to use something like that, I'm in a situation where I can't wash my hands, there are alternatives that are, some of them are made out of essential oils, different ways that are not as harsh, so they will kill off and sanitize things that should be killed off, but they're not going to completely wipe out your gut or not your skin microbiome when you're talking about hand sanitizers. That's one of the microbiomes that's getting disrupted. We also, I was reading up on this, we need to watch out for kind of the blue light that electronics put out, because that keeps us awake at night. We probably have heard about that because it's something that's talked about a lot these days. And when we get kept up at night, it means that our microbiome actually gets disrupted as well. So if we're not getting adequate sleep, good quality sleep, adequate hours, that can actually disrupt your microbiome. So trying to be mindful of that, turning off electronics a bit before bed, 30 minutes to an hour before bed, so you have a chance for things to wind down, for your melatonin to peak and help you get into a good sleep. But we can't have that really when we're bombarding our system with those blue light frequencies. One of the best things that you can do for yourself, and also like if you have kids, is to get out there and just spend time in the dirt, like garden, dig in the dirt, because that actually helps support your immune system in developing. So there's an interesting study or hypothesis out there that basically when we became so focused on kind of killing everything that could potentially be bad, all of those microbes, when we started with these products to wipe everything out and we became afraid of going out and digging in the dirt, that actually really contributed to developing an imbalanced immune system. Because when you think about it, with something like an autoimmune disease, our body starts attacking itself and other things that it shouldn't be attacking. And it becomes kind of hypervigilant. Well, if we actually have given our immune system training in being able to determine friend from foe, like by doing things like getting outside and digging in the dirt, gardening, and having that exposure, it promotes the healthy, balanced training of your immune system so that it knows that certain things need to be responded to and certain things don't always need to be responded to. So that's just a great way, and especially for kids whose microbiome is still growing and developing and whose immune system is still developing. Don't keep them inside. Don't sanitize everything and worry about them touching things. Let their immune system actually start to develop, because there are studies and research out there that particular focus on, being ultra clean and ultra sanitized is not doing us any favors, and it's promoting the rise of these kinds of diseases, which about 100, 200 years ago weren't anything that we really knew about or whether they even existed. So another thing that's very beneficial for supporting the microbiome is taking things like prebiotics, which are, if it's hard to eat that much leafy green vegetables in your life as you really should be eating for your gut microbiome, there are ways you can take like a pill version or powdered up stuff that gives the microbiome food so that it can repopulate and it can grow and it can thrive and it has all its nutrients. So prebiotics, and then you probably have also heard of probiotics. So prebiotics are like the food for the good microbes, and then probiotics are actually like taking capsules that contain all of the good bacteria that you're trying to repopulate. So you can start to take those. And I often suggest working with somebody who might be able to point you in the direction. Not everyone is created equal in terms of those probiotic products, and not everyone is ideal for each person. So ultimately, like what I do sometimes when it comes up for clients is I muscle test to see which is the most optimal for them at this particular time, because it actually changes. I was talking to a colleague last week, and ultimately, it's usually every 4 to 6 months that we actually have to change up the probiotics that we're using. So if you've been taking the same formulation for 3 years, you might want to actually explore changing that up, because different formulations have different strains of bacteria. So you might be actually just tipping things more into imbalance, because you might have those particular strains in abundance, and some others that you really need, you're not getting. So just a little bit of more information about probiotics, because we hear probiotics, take probiotics, and yet most of the time, many people have just been on the same version of it for many, many years. And the last thing that I point to as really beneficial for helping rebalance and support your microbiome is the work that I do with the body tox system. So one of my teachers actually was a PhD researcher on the Human Genome Project. And so she's studied a lot about the microbiome, genetic sequencing. When I talk about the epigenetics, that comes from studying with her and working with her. And so we've developed specific tools for being able to energetically rebalance and correct imbalances in the microbiome, so we can get rid of or help the body, we don't get rid of, but we help the body to reduce the number of certain strains that may have overgrown, to repopulate strains that aren't there or are very, very small numbers and they should be larger. We can help address microbes that have gone into what I referred to before, that frenemy state where they start acting like bad bacteria. We can get them to start behaving correctly again. And that's all without taking any sort of medication, any supplement. Western science is still trying to figure out, as it comes to understand the microbiome and just how important it is, how it can address it. And we can use the tools that I have to be able to understand what the imbalances are, and then to ask the body and to ask the microbiome to start to rebalance and repopulate. So it's really, really powerful. And that's some of the most powerful tools that often come up in working with people with something like autoimmune disease, is to look at underlying imbalances in the microbiome in terms of profile of different strains of bacteria. Also working on helping to heal that leaky gut. So helping to resolve that tendency of permeability, which is also being linked to a lot of inflammatory issues in our health. And so by helping the body to maintain a tighter seal, we can really benefit things. So I hope this has been very helpful and useful to kind of understand that there really is this connection between the good bacteria that live within us, and they do lots of important things, including help our immune system, and how we've become really tipped into this imbalance in our systems, this tendency of having certain strains of bacteria, maybe an overabundance, maybe some that shouldn't even be there, and how that leads to disease. And more importantly, I hope I've given you some ideas of things that you can do to start to love on and support your microbiome, because whether you're somebody who's dealing with autoimmune disease or not, taking care of your microbiome is important for your health and to protect yourself ultimately if you don't have something like an autoimmune disease, to lessen your predisposition to have something like that develop. You want a healthy and balanced microbiome. So make sure that you're supporting it. Good diet, avoiding antibiotics when possible, avoiding all of those overused antibacterial products, giving your body rest, watching out for blue light, decrease your stress level. I didn't add that to the list, but I talked about that as a factor. So finding ways to lower your stress, exercise, meditation, all of those good things. Getting outside in nature, spending time in the dirt especially, looking into prebiotics and probiotics, and lastly, exploring something like Body Talk and how it could help you rebalance your microbiome and get it working in your favor and helping support your health. So thank you for taking the time to listen today. And until next time, I will see you in health.